like to apologize. I had some vehicle trouble this morning, so I was running a little bit late. Nothing like running up the stairs to get your blood going in the morning.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman. It gave us time to regroup, so we're fine. Yeah, thank you.
Madam Chair, when we left yesterday, we were talking about income tax. Is that where you want to pick up on 20?
If you wouldn't mind, could we review everything where we're at?
Certainly.
Just to make sure for the revisers and research.
Excellent.
That we're all on the same page. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, members. Yesterday, you started by going over 2597, Senate substitute for House Bill 2597. The bill, as it passed the Senate, contained essentially 5 provisions: a property tax exemption for antique utility trailers, a provision allowing for the proration of certain personal property taxes when the property is acquired or sold during the year, a provision related to the classification of land in the CRP grassland program, provision related to the classification of land in the land used as zoos or incidentally for agritourism, and then provisions from the Senate related to changes to the revenue neutral rate process that municipalities must use. The House made an offer to include all 5 of those provisions and also include the contents of House Bill 2724, which also relate to the revenue neutral rate provisions, specifically as it relates to the statewide uniform school finance levy, and also to include the provisions of House Bill 2618, which provide for a 5-year property tax exemption for property leased by municipalities for purposes of business incubators in rural settings. The Senate responded to that that they would consider that offer and would also counter with an offer to include increasing the exemption for residential properties from the 20 mil property tax to $65,000 and provide for a formulaic increase to that amount in future years, and also to provide for the property tax reimbursement provisions that are currently in House Bill 2416. And to the extent of my notes, that was the end of the discussion on House Bill 25, Senate substitute for House Bill 2597, and after that, the conference committee moved on to House Bill 2239, so this might be a good time for me to pause and see if there are any corrections or changes to that, or if my notes accurately captured the discussion yesterday.
Eddie, I don't know if I heard, did you mention the antique trailer provision?
If I didn't, it was an oversight on my part. That was the first provision in Senate substitute for House Bill 2597.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is what I had in my notes. I just want to make sure that the contents of 2724 was just the 20 mil trigger. There was no other content in that. And then the contents of 2618 was the property tax incubator that we had discussed.
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
Okay, next the committee moved on to Senate substitute for House Bill 2239, initially discussing the current provisions of that, which include the Golden Years provisions, the SALT Parity Act, the Kansas State Historic Sites checkoff provisions, a section that contains subtraction modifications for net operating loss, carry forwards of carried backs, a subtraction modification for the federal disallowance related to the work opportunity tax credit and employee retention tax credit, a 10% increase to the standard deduction, provision related to net operating losses related to the sales of certain historic hotels, and technical and community college contribution tax credits. The Senate then requested consideration, is I think the best way to phrase it, of some additional provisions in that bill. The provision of Senate Bill 87 related to only Atchison County, and also to require ballot language clarifying the distribution of revenues. the provisions related to a back-to-school sales tax holiday, the provision related to sales tax authority for EMS services in Wilson County to allow for an election, and the provisions related to sales tax on utilities for commercial and industrial consumers. The House then followed up mentioning a request for consideration of provisions related to sales tax exemption for agricultural fencing when destroyed by wildfires, to request consideration of a sales tax exclusion for separately stated shipping and handling charges, to request the consideration of a provision that would essentially ratify an election for sales tax held by the city of Latham, and to request consideration of the contents of House Bill 2732 related to the Gage Park Improvement Authority. And that is the end of my notes. There, I noted that the committee was picking up discussion of 2106 and wrapped up for the night prior to diving into that.
Madam Chair, I guess one thing first of all, did you have any questions? Okay. It was my understanding, I know 2239 was kind of our sales tax vehicle. A lot of those provisions that Mr. Penner had first described when Amelia had reviewed 2239, I'm assuming that we're going to move those provisions down into the income because most of that content was income tax. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We use 2239 for income tax across the floor, and so that's where I think the confusion arose yesterday. So yes, that would be fine.
Okay. At this time, do you want to have any further discussion on either 2597 or 2239, or pick up our discussion on 2106?
If you wouldn't mind, Mr. Chairman, I would like to clarify what we keep in 2239 and then what we're moving over to 2106, just so that everyone is aware.
Okay. Let's see. Mr. Penner, it might be easier. Are there any non-income tax provisions in 2239?
As it currently stands coming over?
Yeah,
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I think you're thinking what I am. Can we keep income tax in 2239?
That's exactly where I was going. That would keep those provisions there and keep us from jumping between two different bills.
Appreciate that. Thank you. It'd help with my notes.
If staff could accommodate that request, that might be simpler to.
Thank you.
And then 2106 would be our sales tax vehicle then. Okay. You guys follow that. So this will be all sales tax. Yeah, that'll be our, or no, that'll be our income tax bill. Yes. And then 2106 will become the sales tax bundle. 2106 will be the income tax bill. No, 2106 will be our sales tax. Certainly. Okay. Sure, yeah. Madam Chair, my ranking member had a question, possibly for research on the fiscal note on what is now 2239.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Eddie, a couple of these items do not have fiscal notes, and I was just wondering, the net operating loss, carry back, carry forward, do we have a number there? And along with that, WOTC and ERC exemption, do we have numbers?
So the fiscal notes that were provided upon those bills being introduced and heard indicated that the Department of Revenue didn't have sufficient data to specifically quantify them. I know that the department has continued working on those, and just yesterday did provide an update that the combination of those three provisions they indicated would result in a reduction of SGF receipts of at least $100 million. They indicated that the majority of that was related to the employee retention credit, but they are still working on putting a finer point on exactly distinguishing that amount across those provisions and also working on the timing of that.
Mr. Chairman, do you mind, Eddie, if I, thank you. I have grave concern over that fiscal note all of a sudden popping up and combining all three of those. Would you get a breakout? And, I mean, we had hearings on them, they crossed the Senate floor, and it was always negligible, unknown, and that is a very large number to come back in the 11th hour.
The NEG unknown is negative unknown in this, is the only thing I wanted to provide there, but I've certainly asked the department to get us whatever breakout they can on that, and so they are working on that.
Madam Chair, do you want to go over the provisions of 2239 then?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So at this time, I will consider 2239 to be the Senate's offer, or that Senate position as it came over from the Senate. Looking through those provisions, one of the pieces that made a lot of sense to me was first of all, the SALT parity on how we handle pass-through income with regards to federal and state. I think that would create some parity, some equity across how we handle our pass-through tax. So we will consider, or we'll accept that as the Senate position and be agreeable with that. I might turn to the revisers on the tech college and the community college tax credit piece of that. Could you brief us where we're at on our limits, percentages? I want to make sure I've got this right, because I know the House passed a version of that. I can't remember what the bill was when it left the House chamber, but just want to make sure we understand the differences and where we stand on that before we accept a certain position.
Mr. Chairman, the House Bill 2239, as amended by Senate Committee of the Whole, Section 32 is this provision. It would provide a tax credit equal to 60% of the contributions to community colleges, to a community college or a technical college, for capital improvements, deferred maintenance, or purchase of technology or equipment. The limits, so it's community college or technical college, and it's 60% of the contribution. It is for tax years 22 through 26, and the amount of the annual credit per taxpayer shall not exceed $500,000 per year. The tax credit shall not exceed $1 million per year for any one community college or technical college, and the total amount of credits annually shall not exceed $7 million.
And if I remember correctly, the 60% is different. The House position, I think, was 100%. I like the Senate position on that. It gives everybody a little skin in the game if it's not a dollar for dollar match. So I'd like the 60%. I believe the House limits, rather than the $1 million, I think the House limits were 500,000. And I would make the offer in expanding this. I guess I would make the offer initially to, as far as the each individual institution, if we could drop that limit back to the $500,000 limit, and then as far as an individual contributor, making that limit 250,000. And that would be our offer on that provision at this time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we will take that back and look at it. I appreciate the offer, so. And you want to keep the 60% on the,
Yes, we would agree to the Senate's position on the 60%.
okay, thank you.
My vice chair reminded me that we have I think the House position was 3.5 million, so we just doubled it because the House position in our bill was just for tech colleges. We added in community colleges, which doubled that fiscal note. Would the Senate consider a $5 million cap also, please?
That makes sense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll definitely consider that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I apologize. Staff was trying to resolve a different issue back here, and we missed what cap number you just said there.
$5 million.
$5 million.
On
Okay,
the
thank you.
total program cap, yeah. Would also like to accept the Senate's position on the State Historic Site Checkoff Program. And I think as far as the positions that we're willing to accept, that is probably there's a few of these other things that we just want to take some time to look at, make sure that we get an accurate fiscal note from revenue or figure out what the discrepancy was there before we move forward on the tax credits for the employee retention credit, the WOTC and the ERC. I can't remember what the acronyms always stand for, but that would be what we're willing to accept on the Senate positions at this time. Not saying no to the other pieces, we just want to make sure we have an accurate fiscal note on those.
No, that's understandable, Mr. Chairman. I hope that you'll keep in mind during testimony, we heard that it was basically double taxation, that the money had been taxed in two different instances. So even though the fiscal note does come back, I hope that that is money that we can return to taxpayers.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Did you want to discuss any, because you had also made the offer of Senate Bill 282 and some of the income tax provisions there. Do you want to pick up? I think that's where we left off yesterday, or?
Yes, that would be great, Mr. Chairman. So
Okay.
we'll start down the list. Just a second. Mr. Chairman, we would want to make sure that clarification, it's my understanding that you would still like to look at the standard deduction and the other items that we discussed. You do not want to exclude those,
Absolutely.
right? We just want to make sure we get to a decent fiscal note.
Yes.
Okay, that's my understanding. They're still in. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
So we would offer the aviation tax credit that passed the House and out of the Senate.
And I'll go ahead and say that's a position we accept. I know that bill actually went through the House Commerce Committee, but it had a lot of support. So that's a provision that we would be willing to accept, the Senate's position on that.
Great. The other item that we're looking at is we did have teacher classroom supplies, 10 million. I would ask that if we do if you do accept it and move forward, that we ask the budget to decrease K through 12 by 10 million. I know that was some of the concern, is that we're picking up a tab that K through 12 should be paying for. And if we decrease their amount by 10 million, this would cover the cost. It would be neutral, but it would get the money back into the teachers' pockets.
Do you mind if I ask a question on that provision?
Absolutely.
How did you come up with the $250? Would you consider a note that was maybe a little bit less, like $150, that would, I know some teachers probably spend less, some probably spend a lot more, so I just want to make sure we're ending up at a good number on that with the fiscal note. I didn't know what the conversation was, where we didn't really have a lot of discussion when we heard this bill on that provision.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a good conversation. Federal, I think it's 500 current, or 250. 250. So it was matching the federal amount is what it was.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's how we pulled that number. I've polled a lot of teachers, and most of them, it is between $100 and $200 that they spend on their classroom, except if it's a science teacher or somebody else, they tend to go considerably above. It's just difficult that our teachers are paying out of their pocket as much as we are providing for school districts for funding. There is no reason for teachers to be paying out of pocket.
Completely agree on that, and I would note that fiscal note probably assumes a maximum, everybody is using the maximum amount, which probably isn't going to be realistic, so that fiscal note probably won't be that $10 million.
Right, and it is, since it is an income tax provision, there is, teachers may be audited. They do need to keep their receipts, as do other business expenses. So we thought that there was some checks and balances this way also.
Was this provision refundable or non-refundable?
It's non-refundable.
Okay.
And non-transferable. Yeah. Okay.
I apologize for interrupting. I don't know if you want to take these provision by provision, but after visiting with my members, I think we'll go ahead and accept the Senate's position on the $250 tax credit.
Thank you. And we'll make the recommendation to the budget to decrease K through 12. Does that alleviate some concerns I heard from House members?
We did have a conversation on that too, and where we don't know what the full utilization would be in the overall scope. Yes, I understand the philosophy behind that, but I really think in the overall scope, $5 or $10 million in the education, that's a lot of money to me, but in proportion to the state finance for schools, I think it would be best to leave that piece off and just go with the amount.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. So the next we had is the Homestead property tax refund, tax freeze. These were in the bill, and the residential property tax. If you'd like to look at those and get back with us, that'd be fine.
Yes, and I did have a question for probably research on this. I know the Homestead property tax refund, it starts out, I think, at $7 million. and then it adds every year that new group of people that would become eligible. At what point did that kind of level out, and what was the fiscal note? If you can get back to me on that, that's fine.
Yeah, the increase isn't only new people coming on, it's also the benefit for people in their second year would grow. But I'd like to get back to you on exactly the point where it's projected to level off.
Okay, thank you. I really like that program, and I'd like to see what the fiscal note would be on it, but that's something that we would really like to consider, so. And the housing pieces, there's a Kansas Housing Investor Tax Credit and the Kansas Affordable Housing Tax Credit. Those provisions actually went through the House Commerce Committee, so I want to make sure I understand those.
Right, or they may be somewhere else in a conference.
That's correct.
Yeah, because I've heard, they actually came out of the Fed and State Committee, so I've heard other, yeah. That makes it difficult when tax is in several different committees.
Correct.
But, yeah. So we'd also like to include the rural opportunity zone as it passed. The Senate, it was in 2237.
Did that include both the extension and the expansion?
We would ask you to consider both.
Okay, we will take that under consideration.
Mr. Chairman, the other Senate position that we had was child daycare services for the businesses. We did pass that. I know that it's something to be considered, if you would.
I'll look again to staff. I know are there any differences between, I think, House Bill 2414 and what the Senate passed? I just want to make sure we understand what the differences are. And again, we can circle back and look at that if we want to just prepare that for later. Yes. Thank you.
So if you'd consider that, that'd be great,
Absolutely.
Mr.
That was one that was very popular in the House committee and House chamber, so.
Thank you. When you take a look at it, I want to make sure that the parents and the individuals that really need it get that tax credit. So, yeah, thank you.
Excellent.
And I think that's all I'm sure there'll be more as the day goes on. Yes, there is actually. We'd like to include Senate Bill 326 also. The short line railroad, we did like the House position on that.
That was on my list to ask for. I know the Senate passed a very, very similar version. We just made one amendment, and if you're willing to accept House position, we'll accept that you accept the House position.
It's okay. Could you explain that? I don't know that.
Yes, the amendment that we had, there was a point that came up during the testimony and the hearing that Class 1 railroads, your large Union Pacific, the large railroads, under the definition of what a short line eligible customer would be. And we just made sure that Class 1s were excluded in the definition of eligible customer.
It's okay. Are you okay? Okay, great. Sorry, we had a hot mic there. We just need to make sure that we were okay with that, and then Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we did run that language past the proponents. They were okay. They informed us that that was the intent of the bill originally, and one of our opponent testimony brought up the situation where a Class 1 could come in and accept those transfers and be an eligible customer. So we wanted to make sure it was targeted just toward the short line rails.
We think that's a good change. I think they're concerned about other provisions, and they want to make sure that if this goes in, some other stuff goes in.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
If we're going to continue on our conversation with income tax, the House would like to offer our position on House Bill 2727. It is a bill that eliminated the Social Security tax or income tax cliff at $75,000. Social Security income becomes 100%, goes from 0 to 100% taxable. We put a linear formula in there to where it graduates depending on what their range is between $75,000 and $85,000. At $85,000 is when they hit the 100%. It's a very low fiscal note. I think it's $2 million. That formula could be extended if we wanted to stretch that graduation out a little bit. Certainly willing to look at any ideas you may have, but would like to offer your consideration of 2727.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll definitely take a look at it. The Senate position has been to remove state income tax completely on Social Security and completely on retirement income tax. And we've passed that twice last year in two different provisions. So I know it is conferenceable. I would ask that you consider that, and maybe you could come up with a formula that we could work toward eliminate.
Compromise.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly. A couple other things that the House had positions on in House Bill 2394. It was a research and development tax credit for LLCs and S corps. This was kind of came out of the 2012 tax cuts when income tax was eliminated for those. This tax credit still existed for C corps because they were still taxed. However, this tax credit was removed in 2012, and then it never got put back on. The fiscal note, I believe, is $1 million, and would just like to see if you would consider adding that back in so our LLCs still have access to that tax credit.
And what is the bill number?
Bill number was 2394.
2394. Yes, Mr. Chairman, we'll take a look at it. We just had a conversation before we started this morning that we tend to go the wrong way on tax credits, and I get that that's where we're at, but I hope that the tax committee and others will be able to, and I know you and I asked for it, a deep dive on tax policy to do a true study of where we're headed and have an overall picture instead of just picking and choosing here and there. But we will absolutely consider it based on where we are right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree with your comments. That's, at some point, you get so many tax exemptions and tax credits, you've picked winners and losers, and at some point, you just have to stop and overhaul your tax system, so. The only one I wanted to include now as a final request was House Bill 2186. This is a bill that we heard last year, and in light of the marketplace and decoupling bill that we passed, this one does have a fiscal note of, it's just a little over $20 million, I believe. This is single factor apportionment for corporate income tax. Currently, Kansas has a 3-factor apportionment, and this was something that it did have a little bit higher fiscal note, which is why we didn't add it last year, and we passed it out of committee this year. We'd like your consideration on that, but with the understanding it does have a little bit higher fiscal note of all of these provisions that we've talked about.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I think it's a $20 million fiscal note. And
Yes, just a little bit over. We did add one NAICS code in tax committee as an amendment, so I'm sure it's a little bit more than that. Maybe, I can't remember exactly where we're at on that right now, but it's going to be just a little over 20 million.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you bringing it up. This is a fairly large policy change for the Senate not to have taken a look at it at all. We haven't considered it, we haven't seen it in committee or, but we will talk about it and take a look at it. I just don't want to get your hopes up.
No, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, that concludes, I think, what we had in the House provisions on that at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pretty hefty list. If we may continue and go on to 2106 and then come back and review these and make sure of where we are on our positions. I know that my teammates had some consideration and they want to make sure certain things get in the bill. So
Certainly.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you have some offers on 2106 that you wanted to address?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be glad to. Anything to bring taxes down, I'm all for it.
Or do we want to go back, because we had made some
We could
offers
start with
back and
like
forth.
the
to
fencing and everything that you had, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement on the fence,
Okay.
yeah.
One provision I forgot to mention yesterday, the Senate's version of Senate Bill 318 on the fencing also included some other provisions. And I wanted to know if you would consider removing the overall exemption on fencing supplies. As a farmer and rancher, I appreciated that, but I felt like maybe that was something that we should try to vet through committee process and try to make sure we had due diligence on that one. There was also a provision in there, I think, for property that was destroyed by a natural disaster, property tax abatement. Was the Senate's position on that, was it optional at the county level? Okay. As long as that's optional, that is a position that we would be favorable to accepting. I just forgot to mention that when we discussed the wildfire fencing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Instead of taking up everybody's time, we'll consider it and get back to you if that's.
Right, and I understand that's a deviation from what the Senate position was, so certainly
Discuss.
respect your time and discussion and thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I know you offered the 327, the shipping and handling, and I think we're both in agreement on that. Okay. In Wilson County, we were both in agreement on that.
I know one of the first things you asked about was the Atchison County, and we're in agreement with the sunset on the sales tax currently up there. You also asked about the ballot language that's required from here forward for everyone. And before we accept that, do we have an idea of what that language would look like yet, or we'll work on that? Okay. But we're very favorable to that. We just want to make sure we see what that language looks like.
Thank you. We might consider what was in Senate Bill 87 as amended. I think it has ballot language in it.
Okay.
What came out of the tax committee.
Okay.
So, yeah, it might be a good starting place, not necessarily a landing.
Certainly.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that you consider the coupons, removing the sales tax exemption on manufacturers' coupons. The Senate passed this with an understanding that we use language that was recommended by the streamlined sales tax. It doesn't mean that we are compliant with that language. We have applied for an exemption, but we will not know whether we have the exemption until May, the 1st of May. May 5th, okay. The first week, 2 weeks in May, how's that?
Okay.
That gives enough leeway. Yeah. And it also has removing the manufacturer's sales tax on vehicles, just removing the sunset.
Removing the sunset, okay. I think that's the vehicle sunset is probably a good idea. It seems like we revisit that and we just keep extending it, so we might as well remove the sunset on that and make it a permanent law. Do we know on what you're offering for the manufacturer's coupons on everything? Are you offering, no, I think we have a fiscal note. A little over 2 million on that one. Are you offering that we include that basically determined on what the streamline agreement does? Or does it really matter what streamline is? We'll just go forward with this?
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that, and maybe this is a heavy lift before our next meeting, but it's my understanding that we passed online sales tax in order to handle what the objective of streamline was. So I'm not so sure that, I don't want to challenge that we stay in streamline in the conference committee by any means, but it's my understanding that at some point it may be cost prohibitive to continue the relationship with streamline. Eddie, would you want to?
I'm not certain, what is the request that you?
Well, isn't there a fee for us to be in streamline?
I don't believe that there's a fee to be a member of Streamline. The Streamline agreement does allow for the Streamline customer service providers to retain a portion of sales tax that is voluntarily remitted through the Streamline program. And so that's kind of the cost to the state. I'll check with the revenue and see if I know that it is about 60 million annually that we get through the Streamline customer service providers. I will check with the revenue in terms of how much is retained by those service providers.
Madam Chair, you bring up an interesting point, though. I think we need to take a look at how much that number has changed now that we passed the marketplace facilitator and truly see what the impact of that is. I think you bring up an excellent point there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe if we could get that information, it might be worth discussing then. Yeah, and fee, non-fee, yeah. We've looked at giving a retainer for businesses in Kansas for collecting sales tax too. We did pass that out of the Senate Tax Committee, but it did not cross the floor, so I didn't know if you would be comfortable looking at that or not this year. Did it have a bill number? What? If you're wanting to offer that, we'll certainly take a look at it. If you take a look at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we can get a bill number so we know what language to
Yeah.
look at, that
If
would
I may, Mr. Chairman, there's one that I know that you worked diligently on last year and myself, but where we found the discrepancy in the form from the language in statute on the annual, quarterly, monthly accelerated prepayment language. I would like to just delete that language if we could, in the sense that we have annual, quarterly, monthly, and there would be no longer a prepayment or an accelerated payment. I think that would clean it up for revenue, and it would definitely clear it up for our businesses that are collecting that.
Okay. Yeah, I know there was some discrepancy in the interpretation of the statute, and it sounds like we haven't found a resolution on that yet.
Mr. Chairman, I still, many times when I speak, I bring up your efforts and how you found the discrepancy between the statute and the form. And I just appreciated that diligence and you digging in and finding that. Thank you.
Again, did you have a bill number on that? Do you know which item that was? And
We had that in a bill. I do have the bill number, just a second. $23,16.
yes, would be happy to consider that and look at that language.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have another big ask.
Okay.
We are trying to decrease taxes for as many Kansans as we possibly can. And the Senate, we had a position in the tax committee to remove sales tax for electric, gas, and other utilities for commercial. As I said yesterday, a few years ago, we tried, this group was not involved, but others tried to put that sales tax on individual homeowners. And I think instead we should go the opposite way, remove it for commercial.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. I think fairness there is the word. I just wanted to make sure we had a good understanding on where we were landing overall with our fiscal note. I know that was, I think, is it 50 million? So excellent concept. Would certainly take that into consideration.
The provision related to sales tax on utilities that was in 2316 as well didn't go into effect until July 1 of 2023, so it doesn't have any fiscal impact in fiscal year 23. Fiscal year 24 is 55.8 million. I'll work out that math one of these days. And then in fiscal year 25, it's 62.1 million because of the 12 months effect in fiscal year 25. The fiscal year 24 is 11 months in essence.
Is that all funds or is that SGF?
Yeah, that is all funds. Of those amounts, 9 million and 10 million were highway fund, and 47 and 52 million were general fund.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any other, if we're looking at the sales tax issues, is there any other requests from the Senate side?
Just the ones we discussed yesterday, the back to school sales tax holiday, if you would consider that.
Certainly.
Yeah. I think that's all the list.
We did have a couple positions. I'm not sure where the Senate stands on these because I know they're sales tax exemptions that I don't think came over before your committee. They are fairly small fiscal notes, so I just wanted to see if you would consider them. House Tax Committee passed out House Bill 2684. It was a sales tax exemption for area agencies on aging. And that kind of tied back to a fairness issue because there are some area agencies on aging that are completely within one county. They're large enough within one county to provide those services, so they are county-owned and therefore, by definition, tax exempt. out in rural western Kansas and rural areas, a lot of times multiple counties have to get together to form these area agencies, and they are not specifically under one county government, therefore they are not tax exempt. So their tax dollars or their revenue doesn't go quite as far in providing services. I think that one was, I can't remember what the fiscal note was on that. I didn't have that on my list, but I believe it was like $100,000. Just wanted you to maybe perhaps consider that one. We also had a House Bill 2709. It was a sales tax exemption request for live theater. And House Bill 2721. This one has a little bit different fiscal note, but it's tax exemption on over-the-counter drugs.
What was the fiscal note on
I
that?
believe the fiscal note was about $20 million on this one. This kind of came up in our discussion on food sales tax and how removing sales tax on the items that are most important, most necessities, that's one of the items that came up. Understanding it's a fairly large fiscal note, but
Yeah, I understand, Mr. Chairman, and we've heard also they'd like to see sales tax removed on clothing and other items too. We need that overall big.
where do you draw the line? Yes, I
Yeah,
understand.
we just, but we will consider them. We'll also ask that you consider the Johnson County Christmas Tree Association sales tax exemption. And we did have legislation that was a sales tax exemption for veterans,
Okay.
disabled veterans. You had to be 100% disabled. It modeled a program from Oklahoma.
Do you know what the fiscal notes were on those or bill numbers so I could look that up?
It was Senate Bill 180. The fiscal note was approximately $10 million. The Christmas Tree Association, I think, was 311, if I remember correctly. And the fiscal note was, it was in the hundreds of thousands, I think. It wasn't, no, actually, it may have even been below 100,000, but I'll double check that. for
Okay,
you.
thank you. We'll certainly take those under consideration.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have, the fiscal note was like $10,000. And it was in 2316, but it did start out originally as Senate Bill 311.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I know you and I, throughout the past year or so, have discussed the credit card surcharge bill. Would that fit into this provision, or do you want to try to do that separately, or do you have any position on that?
I don't know if you just saw the revisers look at each other, but
I didn't.
I think they have concern as it not being a tax bill. I would love to get another vehicle.
Oh, okay.
That in a separate vehicle.
Excellent.
You'd be okay with that? I think, do you want to address that?
Sure, Madam Chair. Yes, the credit card surcharge would possibly bring into question that, it's an unrelated tax issue that more is a financial transaction issue, not a tax issue.
Thank you. I just remembered we'd had some conversation over that. I think both the House and the Senate have passed out of committee. Well, I think the House actually passed ours across the chamber, but just wanted to see where we were landing on that issue. But yeah, I don't want to violate any single subject rules. So,
Thank you.
Madam Chair, that concludes our our list.
And I'd like the opportunity to take a look at this and make sure that, I'm sure that there'll be some back and forth. If you wouldn't mind, if Eddie could put together a sheet so that we're all working from the same.
I think that would be very beneficial because I've already lost track of my own notes, so.
Mr. Chairman, when would you like to meet again to continue our discussion? And Eddie, how long do you think it'll take?
Madam Chair, we have a gaming bill on GO today, and I don't know how that debate is going to go, so I don't want to commit and not be able to make that. Would 1 o'clock be?
That sounds reasonable.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's plan on 1 o'clock back in this room.
Okay,
Okay, thank you very much.
thank you.
Eddie, would you include some of the numbers when you go through that as well?
As best as I am able.